Everyone, and welcome to eLearnChat, where it's all about learning. I'm Harold Muliati, filling in for Rick Zanotti today. I'm joined by our co-host Ajay Pangarkar. How are you doing, Ajay?
I'm good. I'm very well. I'm glad to be back and co-hosting with you, Harold. Hopefully, it will be a really smooth ride since Rick is not with us, so you and I can have fun with our guest today.
Yeah, we've got a great guest today. We've got we haven't had him on for a while, but we're excited to see what he's been up to. It's Joe Ganci from eLearningJoe. Let's get going.
How you guys doing? Wow. Should I be afraid? You guys gonna abuse me here during this session here without Rick present?
This show is sponsored by Relate Corporation. Visit us at www.relatecasts.net. Thanks.
Sorry to cut you off there, Joe. It was one of those click the button and it doesn't happen until 5 seconds later sorts of situations. So,
No problem. No problem.
all right. So, as you can see, Joe is in our center position of power. And what have you been up to lately, Joe, in the world of e-learning?
Well, gosh golly, quite a bit actually. And this, of course, as we all have gone through this weird period this past year, a lot has changed in terms of how we're doing things, but some things haven't had to change because we really are in a field that most of the time we don't really have to be present somewhere. In fact, most of the time we're creating asynchronous learning. And so people are able to take that when they want. But synchronous learning as well. Most of it is online now anyway. And I think because of the whole situation with COVID, now that we're finally coming out of it, a lot of those things that have changed are not necessarily going to go away easily. In fact, we might be seeing, I think we're seeing a lot of changes overall, not all of which are going to stay put forever, but certainly we're going to be wanting to accommodate some of those changes for the long term. I'm reading a lot about now about employees who are protesting. They don't want to go back to the office. They've gotten used to working at home. And it's not because they're lazy or anything. It's because the thought of getting into traffic again and commuting every day for 2, 3, 4 hours, plus having to, have all those people around you always gossiping and talking and chattering away. And it's like, we actually get more done at home, right? And a lot of bosses were uncomfortable with that originally because if they didn't see you, they didn't know you were working. But really, it's the output that matters, right? And what they're seeing is that the output coming from those of us who work at home tends to be higher than that of being in the office.
There's the other issue which our friend Jeff Blanchard runs into, where there's certain people in his office that he doesn't like interacting with. Like, I believe the person working right above him is one of those. So just being at home and not having to always be, kind of right near that person is actually way preferable to him.
Well, it's funny.
That's a good point.
Joe, you bring up a good point because work today, we're sort of shackled with the old industrial revolution work environment. And to your point, we are not in that environment anymore. We're in a knowledge work. It doesn't require us showing up necessarily. And so it's a valid point, and it's probably pretty relevant, especially for somebody like you in e-learning that brings e-learning to the forefront, I would assume.
Yeah, in fact, last year when this whole thing started, we all said, well, this is going to make e-learning really come to the forefront now, and we're going to be plenty busy. Well, actually, for several months, I didn't have any work, and I realized it was because a lot of the customers I normally would be working with were holding on to their funds, waiting for the shoe to drop. They didn't know how long this thing was going to last. Of course, people were wanting to believe, it's going to be over 2 months. Well, it wasn't, in 3 months and 4 months and 5 months. So they understandably were holding on to their pocketbooks and saying, yeah, we're going to wait because we don't know what's going to happen next. So let's wait. Well, then, finally, after like a couple of months, maybe 3, 4 months, people started realizing, okay, we can't wait any longer. So then, the work started piling in. It's been good, though. I've I did a very large project for NASA at JPL, which was gratifying because it was not just, hey, create some content for us online. This was a case of let's create a template in several different tools. And so I created a similar template in Adobe Captivate, Articulate Storyline, in iSpring Suite, and PowerPoint, and there was a fifth one. Well, oh yeah. Well, there was also creating it in PowerPoint for importing into Captivate and creating in PowerPoint for importing into Storyline. So there were 6 different templates in essence. Okay,
Wow.
PowerPoint alone, PowerPoint with the intention of bringing it into Captivate, PowerPoint with the intention of bringing it into Storyline, and then Captivate alone, Storyline alone, etc. So yeah, that was very interesting because it really helped to see where the strengths and weaknesses of each tool was. I mean, I kind of knew already, but it really gelled because what was easy in one tool was not easy in another, and vice versa. So it was a pretty good experience also for me, just because it really helped to bring to the forefront, why would I want to use this tool over this tool and when,
Yeah.
that sort of thing. So there was that. That was a pretty good one. And I
Well,
did
you
a
got me
large
geeking
project
out. You got me geeking out, Joe, a little bit when you said NASA, because I'm a bit of an armchair, astronomer. I love planets. I've always have, and so I'm a little envious of you working with NASA on these kind of projects.
Well, you know what? Yes, I also have been an astronomy geek all my life, but not to say that that I spend a lot of time out there in dark fields, trying to look at planets and such. Whereas I have a good friend who lives out in Santa Cruz, California, and he posts the most tremendously beautiful photos of deep deep space galaxies and such, that because he's got a really good telescope with a camera and such, and I'm just in awe of the kinds of things he's able to do. But yes, absolutely. I mean, I geek out every time I see anything that's space related, especially now that we're looking at the Mars rover and everything else that's been happening there. So yeah, I spent some time out there at JPL, and it was like being in Disneyland for me because I was seeing so many cool things there. Well, all right, so that was good. But as far as the work itself was concerned, unfortunately, it wasn't. It wasn't like I was teaching astronauts anything. Okay, I was creating templates for them. But as part of the template making, I made sure that things like quizzes, I put in sample questions that were all, of course, related to space travel or the NASA program. So yeah, that was fun. Did a large project also for brand, a company that protects brands. And when I say protects brands, I learned something in this process too, because brands are not just, hey, we don't want people talking bad about a company, so let's see how we can counter that. But also it encompasses everything like malware, and phishing and spam and all that stuff too. So that was pretty good.
Security stuff, that kind of stuff going on.
Exactly. So that was pretty interesting too. In all this, I've been in this field a long time, and I really, really enjoy my field. But I also have seen so many of the same issues come up over and over. And in fact, in many cases, the problems that I've seen in the past seem to be growing now in some areas, but not necessarily in every area. I see, for instance, that some really good e-learning is being created now. And people might find it hard to believe that we were actually creating really good e-learning back in the 90s as well. In fact, in many cases, we're creating better e-learning then than we see now in most cases. But the impetus or the onus of having to, the old adage, of course, do you want it fast, do you want it good, or do you want it fast, good, or fast, good?
It's quality, fast.
It's fast, good, or cheap. You got to pick two.
Fast, good, or cheap. Thank you. Everything I do is free, so no, I'm kidding. Yeah, fast, good, or cheap. So, yeah. So but if you were really to ask that question, the honest answer would be all three, please. And that's really what everybody wants. They want it fast, cheap, and good. So, how do we get there? And I'm trying to work in ways that we can get good and fast, that is also cheap, at least cheaper than it has been. So it, by in and of itself, the whole industry has been pushing down the cost of e-learning quite a bit. Partly because we used to create these huge courses, and that was ridiculous. We would create courses that were 40 hours of e-learning, that sort of thing in a particular area. Whereas now it tends to be an hour, two, maybe at most, sometimes it's 15 minutes, of course. So certainly the amount of content that you put in e-learning has been reduced a lot. And that's a good thing in most cases, though maybe not in every case, because sometimes they leave out important stuff. Secondly, though, there are a lot more players out there in the world now who are promising to do things on the cheap. That we didn't used to have that as much. So yeah, the cost of creating this kind of learning has gone down, 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 and that means that people like me who are used to being called on to create a lot of interesting things now has to compete with others. I don't mind. That's fine. It pushes me to do something.
On that last one about there being more individuals and organizations that are offering their services for much cheaper. What do you think is the main thing that precipitated that? Like, why has that become such a thing compared to the 90s?
Oh well, I think it's pretty clear why. First of all, if I were in their place, I'd be doing the same thing. Okay. In the 90s, the United States, Europe, and some other parts of the world were already quite advanced in technology, but not every area was. Then it started to spread. So then we had a lot of countries that prior had very little infrastructure for technology that now was doing quite well with that regard. So now they were capable of doing something that they couldn't do before. And then when they looking to see, because we can do most things online now, they started looking to see, where markets were that they could tap into. E-learning was a market they could tap into. And as I said, if I were in their place, I'd probably be doing the same thing, because after all, if it's possible to do and it makes money for me and my family, why not, right? There were a lot of initial pain points that are not necessarily all gone away, because I still hear from people who, for instance, will use a company that's on the other side of the world that is not necessarily, they'll say something like, well, we're really experts in storyline, Captivate, whatever.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's great. But and the promise is, because there are 12 hours difference in time zone, or 13 or 14 hours difference.
That definitely does cause a big difference.
Well, they actually use that as a benefit, because they'll say,
okay,
you guys can keep working until the end of your workday, then hand over the work to us. We'll continue working during your night time. And then the next morning, when you come in, you'll have, it'll be updated further, and you can continue working instead of sort of like doing double shifts, right? Or
right.
Shifting shifts. But the problem was, oftentimes we found that if there was any misunderstanding, if something wasn't entirely clear, then the next morning what we'd find is, they did it wrong, or there would just be a bunch of questions. So now we wasted a day, instead of benefiting from that. So yeah, it's one of those things where caveat emptor, because you have to know what you're getting into with this. The problem then becomes, and I found this for myself too, it takes me longer to try to explain carefully to someone who needs to have it explained to them how, what I need done, than to just do it myself sometimes,
Exactly.
Or to have someone that I know really well do it, because they already know me and they know how I work. So yeah, that's the why part. Yeah. It's better technology. Go ahead.
Definitely, that definitely makes sense to me. And to me, hearing that reminds me of, also, because I'm a graphic designer, and that reminds me of how it's gone in the graphic design world too. Nowadays, if you need to hire a graphic designer, you can get someone for like $1 an hour or something ridiculous like that from the Philippines, and they speak English, and they'll have impeccable design skills and stuff like that. So, as a designer or an illustrator in this country, you have to find something that will, where you'll be able to take the advantage of having that much clearer of a cultural understanding just from living in the country, or something like that. Someone from another country, if you're doing something that has a lot of things that are more specific to the culture, they might have a hard time understanding the right thing from the storyboard. And in design, just as in e-learning, it's something where there's a lot of room for interpretation, which tends to be a bad thing because you want to make sure that you're interpreting the right thing from the client.
Well, yes, absolutely right. And let me also state another thing here that affects us a great deal. It used to be, because we were paying these large courses, that we'd have a team of instructional designers and then separately a team of developers. And whatever tool was being used at the time, like for instance, in the 90s, Authorware reigned supreme. Authorware was the big tool at the time. It was very powerful, right? So you'd have these designers who would then create storyboards. Well, they create a design document, analysis document. They create storyboards, hand them over to developers, usually within the same company, but not always. And then developers would have to go through the storyboard and create the course, lesson by lesson. Well, nowadays, though, instructional designers are expected to know a tool as well. In fact, it's almost impossible to find any job offering where it's not, we're looking for instructional designers, they must know Captivate, Storyline, Lectura, whatever it is. Sometimes they put a whole bunch of, of products up there. And I'm thinking, okay, so are they developers or designers? Well, they're both now. They're wearing more than one hat. And because of that, they're not necessarily creating storyboards anymore. They're just creating it on the fly.
Yeah.
Well,
talking to themselves, kind of.
Yeah, exactly. They got the storyboard in their heads, if you will. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't necessarily think that's a great way to go because, as you know, if I'm going to measure, what is it? Measure twice, cut once. Or because
measure twice, cut once. Well, I mean, the thing is, it's all fine. It's like what I figure is that when you have less of the underlying structure of the project that you're doing, it can be fine when you do it at first. When you do it, you give them the first rough draft or whatever of the project, then it can look fine and stuff like that. But it makes it harder to go back and fix stuff because you didn't have this stuff in stages. You're having to think back. What did I do? And to us, sorry to go back to design again, but it is related where it's like, if I'm designing some digital art or something like that, nowadays I have everything in its own layer. Like I don't flatten layers because you always want to have as much room to go back and fix stuff as easy as possible because it will happen.
Sure. Yeah. Every time I've had someone work with me and they're using Photoshop, I'll want them to, make sure every layer stays in place. And then if I do need it to be flattened or something, that's fine. But give me a separate file for that. But never get rid of the original because, too many times there's changes to be made there. So there's been a lot of talk in the industry about what works and what doesn't work, with e-learning. And I'm at that stage now where when I look at something, I pretty much know, what it's going to say. And I'm surprised when it doesn't, maybe. So I still see, for instance, things about learning styles, they're great. They do this. And learning styles have been debunked for years now. Learning styles, the idea of some people just learn a lot better by hearing and some people learn a lot better by watching and listening or drawing it's true, of course. But every study has shown it doesn't really make any difference in terms of learning, unless you are lacking one of the senses, unless you are, you have a disability with hearing or sight or something. You're pretty much going to be there. But I still see things coming out all the time. This is a new report on learning styles and how wonderful they are. Well, no, they're not. And so the problem there, and that's just one example of many things. I read things that I understand the companies, they're trying to get a name for themselves, so they put out these reports, but they're not necessarily thinking things through. And can I give you a quick example of this is sort of related, but not exactly the same, but it's related. One time I was at a conference. There's a conference in Salt Lake City that's been held every year called the Learning Dev Camp Conference. It's been virtual for the last 2 years, but before that, it was always in place at the University of Utah. So one time when I was going out there beforehand, I got about a week before, I got an email from somebody saying, "Hey, we got a new authoring tool that we are creating. We'd love for you to take a look at it and give us any ideas, as far as that's concerned." Now, I get this kind of thing a lot, and sometimes they just want me to do things for free, and I usually won't do that because obviously, if I'm taking time to do a lot of things to help a company make their product better, I should be paid for that, right? So
Yeah.
there's that. But then when I said, "Oh, where are you guys located?" It turned out it was really close to Salt Lake City. So I said, "Hey, I'm going to be out there next week when we meet up in person." Okay, that's great. Wow, fantastic. So I went down there, and Ajay, you know Nancy Reyes.
Yep.
She was out there with us. She was out there at the conference, and so she and I together went to this company. I won't say who it is. This company to take a look at their new authoring tool, and we went to their offices, and the offices were really cool. They were avant-garde. They were really, whatever. They looked cool, and they brought us into their conference room, a big long table, of course, and there was Nancy and I were sitting on one side, and on the other side there were about 8 of them. Okay. And there was a young man there with a laptop who was going to show us the authoring tool up on the big screen. And so projected on the big screen. And so I sort of jokingly said to them before he started, I said, hey guy, I hope you're not going to try to say that this is the most powerful tool, yet the easiest to use as well. And his jaw dropped and he put the mouse down. And he said, how did you know I was going to say that? And I said, because every company wants to say that, but it's impossible to have a tool that's both easiest to use and the most powerful. It's just not possible. And
wouldn't you like your company to
know
know that's the worst and the most difficult tool to ever use?
And the funny thing there was we never saw the tool. They in essence kept us there an hour. They fed us and whatever. That's fine. They kept us there an hour, and they were just asking us questions about what a tool should include. Instead, because I think they were too embarrassed to show us this tool at that point. It was clear. That's the problem is, and then this is why it relates to what I said earlier, is companies are not necessarily doing their due diligence. They're not researching to find out what works and what doesn't work. So in their case, they weren't even looking at other authoring tools to see what they offered. They just had, like a lot of tools, they had created it in-house for some specific purpose, and they started thinking, hey, we could sell this in the open market, But without having looked at other tools, they didn't know, what they had to compete with. The same goes true for the industry as a whole. And in fact, many industries, if you don't do due diligence, if you don't research, then you're going to make mistakes. You hear something about learning styles, you think, oh, that makes sense. Let me go and implement that into this course. And then find out, why isn't anybody learning, better? Well, because if you had done a little bit of research, you would have realized this doesn't help. Okay. And this and that and the other thing, we know that the internet is full of bad advice as well. So you have to use some critical thinking there and make sure that just like in science, you want peer reviewed stuff, that when you are looking at something online in the area of learning, that there are people that are respectable that agree with that, instead of, like, I think this works and the heck with that, everybody else. And they're like, yeah, okay. Anyway, I'll be quiet. So that's so. And I'll just sum it up real quick, and then let you guys continue. So what I'm trying to do is to put together in a way that makes sense a way for me to one day retire. It's not going to happen anytime soon, but set the stage for that by leaving behind a legacy of this is a guide that will really help. There are some really good books out there too, but they all kind of focus on different areas. This is going to be more of, I'm just starting out with this. We need to create some learning. We don't know what we're doing. As I may have mentioned before, I've been with the International Association for Blended Learning for the last few years. I've just temporarily dismissed myself from that because I was getting busy, but I'm going to go back to them. And because blended learning is important as well. You can't just say everything works in e-learning, for instance. It doesn't work necessarily. So yeah, I'm trying to put together something like that. And I think it's time that I start looking for some interns as well to help me out with that regard, people who want to learn more, because I wouldn't necessarily be able to pay them or much, if at all. But if they're interested in helping in this area, maybe, they can reach out to me. I do want to mention too that next week I am going to be teaching a Captivate class on Tuesday and Thursday for Training Magazine, and there's still room available in that class. It's 3 hours each day, and we cover just about everything. And there's homework, and I follow up with you as much as need be as well to make sure. So if you are interested, if anyone is interested in that, they can contact media as well, or I can give you the link to the training magazine.
I'll have to get that link from you so that I can put it in our description so people can see that and go to it if they would like. Yeah.
So Joe, there's 2 points you brought up that were important, I think, to discuss a little further. One is, about these concepts coming up and to your point that they should be somewhat peer reviewed, and secondary, you should be a critical thinker to accept these thoughts. Otherwise, they're just a basis of opinion, unless they're truly coming from a credible source that has already researched it to a certain amount. However, 2 points I want to make. One is the people out there that we know, and I'm not going to name names, but we know some common names out there that want to fight these myths, but are also, in my opinion, and I say that purposely, in my opinion, tend to propagate some of these myths as well. And it just seems very contradictory in our business that, they're saying one thing out of one side of their mouth, and another side of their mouth, they're not practicing what they preach, and which troubles me. I don't know what your thoughts are on that. There's another point I want to make too.
I really would love to talk to you separately about that, because I don't spend a lot of time looking at what people are doing nowadays, because it's kind of, it's stuff I already know most of the time. But I would like to talk to you more about that as well. So maybe let me know when you're available. We can Zoom or something. Okay. Definitely.
Happy. I'm always happy to chat with you, Joe. Absolutely. Okay, the second point is that, our common friend, Mark Lassoff, I drop Mark's name quite a bit with these guys here, but, I love Mark to death. And Mark. Mark brought up a point on, I think it was on Twitter or LinkedIn, I can't remember where, but he says, why are we still using the term e-learning when it actually, and I tend to agree with this, just in full disclosure, when to your point, blended learning or learning as a whole is the purpose that we're trying to do. Actually, the purpose we're trying to do is to improve either performance or anything else out of it. But why are we still using the term e-learning when e-learning is one of our tools in our toolboxes to propagate learning? And he's trying to move forward and say, we should stop using the word e-learning. And I hope I'm not paraphrasing him here, but that's my interpretation.
No, I think you're right. And, Mark, and I respect Mark a great deal. We're friends, and I love how he's shaking up the industry a bit too, because in that regard, definitely I agree with him there. E-learning, the term, we used to call it computer-based training for years and years, and then it became e-learning. And people will say it was Jay Cross, who's died several years ago now, but he came up with that term, and it kind of stuck. The idea of e-learning was based on the idea of email and, e-commerce and all that, of course. So it kind of made sense. But yes, we are not. It's different from saying, hey, we're in the e-commerce industry, but we should just call ourselves a commerce industry. It's like, yeah, maybe, but no, you're focusing on the e part of that more than the commerce necessarily. And so there's that. But for learning, you're right. I think in fact, I'm about to embark on a new project for a client that is going to start exactly there, where we're going to determine what makes sense for e-learning, but what doesn't make sense for e-learning and what should be done instead. You're absolutely right. Learning, and I need to change my email from eLearningJoe to just LearningJoe.
Well, there's one thing about branding, and there's another thing about the tool. But to your point, though, I'm not taking credit for this. It was just, I've always believed in that thought, and Mark just put voice to it and opinion to it, which is great. And I do encourage people to follow you and people like Mark, because there's a lot of value that you and Mark and a few other people we know bring to light. To your point again, to be more critically aware and critically question what we're doing, because really, to me, that's what learning is about. You need to question things to discover, right? That's the purpose of learning.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If you're just using a water hose to feed people information, or you're not allowing them to think for themselves ever. Instead, if you're going to create any kind of learning, you really should be also focused on making sure that learning is making them think. And in that regard, the old ideas of having stories, case scenarios, decision points, all that kind of thing, is really, now we have so many different options there where we can prod them a bit to think through things and what would you do in this situation? really can be so much more helpful than just spoon feeding them a bunch of information. It doesn't work.
But you know what's
necessarily.
interesting, Joe, is that because when I think about it, you come from, I believe, and if I'm not mistaken, you come from a background of IT originally, and being an IT background in IT, I think, right? If I'm not mistaken.
Well, no, I got
programming-
a computer science. I got a computer science degree. Okay, but while I was still an undergrad, I started creating e-learning for college where I was at, and I never looked back. So yes, in a way, I have an IT, but no way am I comparable to Mark, for instance.
But to your point, no. But what I'm saying is that you have that foundation where, like me, I'm in accounting, and Mark is also in IT. These professions that we were in, or these educations that we received, taught us. Actually, I would say, and this is meant as a compliment, brainwash us to become critically aware and question. And I think that makes a little bit of a difference when people don't necessarily. I'm not saying people can't do that, but when you're in a program or an education that tells you that you have to do this, it really sheds a different light on how you do things.
Yeah,
and
that's the point.
With that, we're actually at about the end of our time.
Oh man,
it's always a fast show, but
yeah, Harold, in the chat window, I put the link to the training magazine.
Yeah, awesome.
I put it in the chat window. Okay.
So we will make that available so people can find it easily. And I think that's it. That's an interesting thought. So everyone watching, you're in the e-learning industry, you're in the learning industry. Think about how you're representing the industry to people, how you talk about it, how you make learning. Are you propagating these myths that you actually want to work against? Are you putting forward the right image of the industry to actually help people the most?
Well, Harold, it's the old saying again. We're doing adages. I know Joe brought up a few, but it's like if you hold a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Right?
Yeah.
So it's the same thing here. If we're just hammering e-learning all the time, then we're not doing justice to what we're supposed to be doing for the organization or the people that are acquiring the information.
And if we're just trying to force feed people as much info as possible, we're making foie gras, not learners.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah, that's right. Oh man, I won't say
Put
that.
it in the grinder, Harold.
Yeah. Well, very good.
Sounds
Thank
like
you guys for allowing me to.
Go ahead, Joe.
Go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say it's like the Pink Floyd movie where the wall where they're shoving all the students in the grinder, right? That was the analogy, right? The criticism for the Pink Floyd at the time was that they were rebelling because they grew up in a time where education was like assembly line or manufacturing, and you just ground out and believed everything they told you and just walked out in the world that way. So yeah, there's your foie gras analogy.
I think we need to contact Pink Floyd and have them redo that for e-learning now too. Yeah, it's not just classroom. Yeah, very good. Okay, thank you guys. I will hopefully talk to you again sometime soon. But Ajay, you and I will talk soon. Okay, thanks, Harold.
All right, thank you,
Great
Joe.
to
It's
see you,
always
Joe.
great to have you on, and always great to have you on too, Ajay. And if you're watching, subscribe and join us next week for another great eLearn chat. Thank you, everyone, and bye.
See you guys.